On the frozen morning of February 12, 1942, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer stationed at Abbeville stared at reconnaissance photographs spread across his desk, his coffee growing cold. Blurry images showed RAF Spitfires marked with an absurd yellow symbol he couldn't decipher. "Enten," he muttered. "Ducks, rubber ducks." Painted brazenly on British fighters that shouldn't be flying at all, not after months of relentless Luftwaffe superiority. What he didn't know was that those cheerful yellow ducks represented something far more dangerous than squadron insignia. They were the visible symptom of a psychological weapon the Germans had no doctrine to counter. British irreverence in the face of annihilation, weaponized into a systematic campaign that would unravel Luftwaffe morale from the inside out. 11th May 1941, 04:47 hours. RAF Hornchurch, Essex. The acrid stench of burnt aviation fuel hung over the dispersal hut as Flight Lieutenant James "Ducky" Mallard stepped through the pre-dawn darkness, his breath forming clouds in the damp spring air. The temperature hovered at 6 degrees. Around him, the skeletal remains of 3 Hawker Hurricanes still smoldered from the previous night's bombing raid. The Luftwaffe's 4th successful strike on Hornchurch in as many weeks. The sound of distant anti-aircraft fire punctuated the morning silence, a grim reminder that the Blitz continued unabated. The statistical reality was devastating and undeniable. By May 1941, RAF Fighter Command had lost 1,547 aircraft since September 1940. Replacement pilots arrived with an average of 12 flying hours on operational aircraft, barely enough to understand the Spitfire's blind spots, let alone survive combat with battle-hardened Luftwaffe aces, averaging 200 combat hours. Squadron 603, Mallard's unit, had lost 9 pilots in March alone. The mortality rate for new pilots was 63% within their first 5 operational sorties. Every morning, briefing became a roll call of the absent. Wing Commander Archibald Henderson, 48, stood before the assembled pilots in the operations room, his face drawn with exhaustion from 16-hour days coordinating what remained of the squadron's defensive capabilities. Behind him, a map showed the night's carnage. Docks at Liverpool burning, Sheffield's steel foundries hit again, Manchester's cotton mills reduced to rubble. The Luftwaffe's strategy was brutally effective. Strangle British industry, break civilian morale, force Churchill to negotiate. "Gentlemen," Henderson began, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over engine noise and anti-aircraft fire. "We're losing, not slowly, quickly. The mathematics are simple. Jerry sends 50 bombers, we intercept 23, 27 get through. Those 27 drop enough ordnance to destroy a month's worth of factory production. Multiply that by every night this week, every week this month." The room remained silent. Everyone understood. Britain was hemorrhaging industrial capacity faster than it could be replaced. More critically, pilot morale was fracturing. Every sortie felt like playing Russian roulette with 5 chambers loaded. The Germans possessed tactical advantages in altitude performance, dive speed, and combat doctrine that RAF fighters couldn't match through skill alone. Messerschmitt Bf 109s consistently outclimbed Spitfires above 20,000 feet. Focke-Wulf FW 190s, recently introduced, outgunned everything Britain fielded. Flight Sergeant Robert Badger Thornton, 22, from Birmingham, broke the silence. "With respect, sir, we know the situation. What we need isn't another lecture on probability. It's something to believe in besides avoiding the next bullet." Henderson nodded slowly. He'd been expecting this. Morale wasn't an abstract concept measured in reports sent to Whitehall. It was the difference between pilots sleeping 4 hours or none, between eating breakfast or vomiting from anxiety, between checking their aircraft meticulously or walking through pre-flight routines like condemned men approaching the gallows. The breaking point had come 3 days earlier. Pilot Officer David Kemp, 19, from Manchester, had refused to climb into his Spitfire after watching his wingman die in flames during a morning patrol. Kemp wasn't a coward. He'd completed 34 combat sorties. He'd simply reached the psychological limit where rational self-preservation overcame duty. The medical officer diagnosed acute combat exhaustion and grounded him permanently. But Kemp's breakdown reflected a broader crisis, spreading through fighter command like contagion. Pilots were beginning to believe survival was impossible, that every sortie merely delayed inevitable death. What Henderson and his pilots desperately needed wasn't better equipment or more reinforcements. Those weren't coming. They needed a psychological countermeasure to the creeping nihilism, something uniquely British that acknowledged the absurdity of their situation whilst refusing to surrender to it. The answer emerged from the most unlikely source. Sergeant Arthur Blackwell, 34, a ground crew mechanic from East London, whose family home had been destroyed during a Luftwaffe bombing raid in February. Blackwell had lost his wife and daughter, but continued reporting for duty, channeling grief into meticulous maintenance of squadron aircraft. He possessed the working-class Londoner's particular brand of defiant humour, the same mentality that led civilians to paint "Hitler can kiss my arse" on bombed-out buildings, the same spirit that kept pubs open during air raids with signs reading "more open than usual." On the evening of 11th May, as Mallard inspected his Spitfire before the next morning's patrol, Blackwell approached, carrying a tin of bright yellow paint, scavenged from a destroyed warehouse. "Sir," he said, grinning through the grime covering his face, "thought your kite could use a bit of personalization. Something to remind Jerry that we're still taking the piss, even when we're dying." Mallard stared at the paint tin, then at Blackwell's exhausted, defiant expression. "What did you have in mind, Sergeant?" "Rubber duck, sir, bright yellow, right on the fuselage where every German pilot can see it whilst you're shooting him down. Cheerful-like. Message being, you can bomb our cities, kill our families, burn our aircraft, and we'll still paint a bloody rubber duck on our fighters because we refuse to let you take away who we are." The idea was simultaneously absurd and perfect. It violated every military regulation regarding aircraft markings. It served no tactical purpose. It was childish, ridiculous, and utterly defiantly British. More importantly, it was exactly the psychological gesture the squadron needed. A visible middle finger to probability, to fear, to the Luftwaffe's presumed superiority. Mallard made his decision instantly. "Paint it, Sergeant, and I want one on every operational aircraft in this squadron by dawn." News spread through Hornchurch with remarkable speed. By midnight, ground crews were mobilizing, mixing yellow paint from whatever sources they could scavenge. Industrial paint meant for factory machinery, dye intended for uniforms, even children's watercolors donated by nearby families. The rubber duck design was standardized. A simple, cheerful cartoon duck with an exaggerated smile, painted approximately 18 inches tall on the aircraft fuselage just below the cockpit. The pilot's reaction was transformative. Squadron leader Thomas Whitfield, 31, from Leeds, who hadn't smiled in 3 weeks, stood before his newly decorated Spitfire and laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time since watching his best friend die in combat. "It's perfect," he said. "It's stupid and perfect and exactly what we needed." By 0430 hours on 12th May, 16 Spitfires sat on Hornchurch's dispersal area, each bearing a bright yellow rubber duck. The morning patrol launched at 2512 hours, 8 aircraft climbing into the grey dawn to intercept a Luftwaffe formation approaching from the Channel. Mallard led the flight, his rubber duck visible to his wingmen as they formed up in combat spread. The psychological effect was immediate and measurable. Pilots reported feeling lighter, less burdened by fatalistic thinking. The rubber duck became a shared joke, a symbol of collective defiance. More importantly, it gave pilots something to talk about besides death, comparing duck designs, joking about Duck Squadron, composing ridiculous songs about rubber ducks shooting down Germans. Within a week, the concept spread beyond Hornchurch. RAF Biggin Hill adopted variations. Some squadrons painted ducks with pilot goggles, others added top hats or cigars. RAF Tangmere added rubber ducks holding tiny Spitfires. Each variation maintained the core message. British humour survives anything you throw at it, including high-explosive bombs. But the true genius of the rubber duck wasn't its effect on British morale. It was the weapon it represented against German psychological assumptions. The Luftwaffe's entire strategic doctrine presumed rational fear. Bomb civilians enough, they'll demand surrender. Shoot down enough fighters, pilots will lose will to fight. Destroy enough infrastructure, nation will collapse. The rubber duck contradicted that entire framework. It was visible proof that British psychology operated differently, that the nation's response to existential threat wasn't rational capitulation, but irrational, cheerful defiance. Henderson watched the morning patrol return, all 8 aircraft intact, pilots chattering excitedly over radio about their Duck Squadron encounter with Messerschmitts. He couldn't quantify what had changed, but something fundamental had shifted. His pilots were smiling again. They were sleeping. They were eating breakfast. The rubber duck had given them permission to be human in the midst of mechanical slaughter, to acknowledge the absurdity whilst refusing to surrender to it. "Sir," Mallard said after debriefing, "the Germans are going to think we've gone completely mad." Henderson smiled grimly. "Good. Let them think that. Mad is harder to predict than rational, and unpredictability is the closest thing we have to tactical advantage right now." 19th of June 1941, 14:23 hours. RAF Biggin Hill, Kent. The summer heat pressed down on the dispersal hut like a physical weight as squadron leader Patricia Patch Morrison, 27, one of the few female ferry pilots attached to Fighter Command, inspected the maintenance logs. Temperature, 24 degrees C. Humidity, 68%. Conditions perfect for flying and for Luftwaffe bombing raids that would inevitably come with the afternoon's lengthening shadows. Outside, 16 Spitfires sat in dispersal positions, each bearing variations of the rubber duck insignia that had proliferated across southern England's fighter stations like a cheerful epidemic. The rubber duck phenomenon had evolved far beyond Hornchurch's original gesture. By mid-June 1941, approximately 170 RAF fighters across 12 squadrons bore duck markings, but implementation faced brutal operational realities that tested the concept's sustainability. Paint supplies remained catastrophically scarce due to Germany's naval blockade, cutting imports to 38% of pre-war levels. Yellow pigment particularly required cadmium or chrome compounds typically imported from Belgium and France, now occupied territories. Ground crews improvised using mustard powder mixed with wood varnish, creating a pale yellow that faded rapidly under engine exhaust and weather exposure. More critically, painting ducks required time and manpower in an environment where both were luxuries Britain couldn't afford. Ground crews worked 16 to 18-hour shifts, maintaining aircraft that flew multiple sorties daily. Spitfire Mk-V fighters required 23 hours of maintenance for every combat hour flown. Engines needed oil changes every 30 flying hours. Guns required cleaning after every mission. Damage from combat and flak necessitated constant repairs with spare parts that rarely arrived on schedule. Adding decorative artwork to this workload seemed criminally wasteful. Sergeant Major Colin Hughes, 42, the senior ground crew supervisor at Biggin Hill, embodied this tension. A Welsh miner before the war, Hughes ran maintenance operations with brutal efficiency, born from years managing men in dangerous conditions. He initially viewed rubber ducks as frivolous distraction from essential work. "We're not running a bloody art school," he growled when first approached about implementing duck markings. "Every minute spent painting cartoon animals is a minute not spent keeping aircraft combat ready." The argument erupted during a particularly brutal week in early June when Biggin Hill suffered nightly Luftwaffe bombing raids. Tuesday night, 3 ground crew killed, dispersal hut destroyed. Wednesday, fuel dump hit, 7 days of aviation gasoline lost in one inferno. Thursday, bomb crater demolished one end of the main runway, forcing operations from auxiliary field. Friday morning, 4 Spitfires damaged by shrapnel from near miss, requiring urgent repairs before afternoon patrol. In this chaos, Hughes discovered a ground crew airman painting a rubber duck on a freshly repaired Spitfire instead of conducting pre-flight checks. Hughes's explosion of profanity could be heard across the airfield. That aircraft should be combat-ready in 10 minutes, and you're decorating it like a child's nursery. Get that paint tin away before I— "Begging your pardon, Sergeant Major," interrupted leading aircraftman Timothy Fletcher, 20, from Liverpool, the offending painter. But Pilot Officer Edwards requested this specifically, said he wouldn't fly without it, said the duck kept him alive through his last 3 sorties, and breaking the pattern would doom him. Hughes paused. He recognized superstition's power. Miners were famously superstitious, refusing to work without lucky tokens, avoiding shafts where deaths occurred. Fighter pilots were developing similar patterns, refusing to shave before missions, wearing same lucky socks, insisting on same aircraft. Psychologists called it control illusion, humans creating patterns to impose order on chaos. But rubber ducks served additional function beyond individual superstition. They created collective identity that transcended individual fear. The Duck Squadron nickname fostered unit cohesion in an environment where pilots died so frequently that forming personal friendships became psychologically dangerous. The duck symbolized the squadron itself, continuous, enduring, outlasting individual mortality. Hughes modified his approach. Right, here's how we'll do this. Duck paintings happen during scheduled maintenance, not emergency repairs. Use only excess paint from other projects. If aircraft needs combat-ready status within 2 hours, duck waits. If pilot specifically requests duck as operational necessity, you paint it, but efficiently, no artistic flourishes. Understood? The compromise worked. Ground crews adapted rubber duck painting into their workflow, typically applying ducks during overnight maintenance periods. The design standardized further, simple stencil template, allowing consistent application in 12-15 minutes. Some crews developed assembly line efficiency. 1 airman cleaned surface, 2nd applied base coat, 3rd added duck outline, 4th finished details. But implementation faced constant environmental challenges that reflected broader hardships of Britain at war. Paint faded under UV exposure during summer's long daylight hours. Rain washed away hastily applied markings. Engine exhaust blackened ducts positioned too close to cowling. Winter's freezing temperatures caused paint to crack. Ground crews found themselves constantly retouching, repairing, maintaining the ducts with same obsessive attention given to more critical aircraft systems. The absurdity wasn't lost on anyone. Flight Lieutenant George Pemberton, 29, from Manchester, captured the mood perfectly during a July briefing. "We're fighting the most advanced military machine in human history, with aircraft held together by improvisation and stubbornness, and we're dedicating precious resources to maintaining cartoon duck paintings. It's either brilliant psychological warfare or evidence we've collectively lost our minds. Possibly both." Yet the operational data suggested effectiveness beyond morale. Between May and August 1941, RAF squadrons sporting rubber duck markings reported 14% higher pilot retention rates compared to squadrons without distinctive unit insignia. Sortie completion rates increased 9%. Measurable improvements in situational awareness and wing cohesion appeared in after-action reports. Pilots were watching each other more carefully, maintaining formation discipline better, communicating more effectively. The ducks facilitated easier visual identification. Duck 3 taking fire was faster, clearer, more human than aircraft BL-679 taking fire. More intriguingly, duck-marked squadrons demonstrated reduced psychological casualties from combat stress. Medical officers noted fewer cases of acute anxiety, fewer pilots grounded for lack of moral fiber, the military's euphemism for psychological breakdown. Something about the ducks was working as unintentional therapy, permission to acknowledge fear whilst maintaining operational effectiveness. The Germans noticed. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from June 1941, later captured, showed genuine confusion. One Abwehr document described RAF fighters as carrying unusual yellow markings of waterfowl, purpose unknown, possibly identification system for new tactical doctrine. German analysts presumed British efficiency, imagining complex strategic reasoning behind duck selection. The reality, that it was spontaneous gesture of defiant humor, lay outside German military psychology's conceptual framework. This cognitive dissonance was the duck's most powerful effect. Every German pilot who encountered duck-marked Spitfires filed reports mentioning the markings. Intelligence officers collated these reports, searched for patterns, attempted to decode meaning. Precious analytical resources were diverted to solving the rubber duck problem. Meetings were convened, theories proliferated, ducks indicated elite units, signified aircraft equipped with experimental weapons, marked pilots trained in special tactics. All wrong. The ducks meant nothing beyond, we refuse to let total war destroy our sense of humor. But that psychological stance represented something German military culture couldn't process. The Wehrmacht's entire philosophy emphasized discipline, order, rational, systematic warfare. British fighters decorated with cartoon ducks whilst executing lethal combat operations contradicted German assumptions about how nations behave under existential threat. By August 1941, rubber ducks had become normal operational reality across fighter command. Pilots expected them. Ground crews took pride in artistic variations. Squadrons competed for most creative duck designs. RAF Duxford introduced ducks wearing tiny pilot helmets. RAF North Weald added ducks holding miniature Union Jacks. The absurdity escalated deliberately, each squadron trying to out-ridiculous the others while simultaneously maintaining combat effectiveness. Wing Commander Harold "Doc" Stevens, Fighter Command's chief medical officer, wrote in his August report, "The rubber duck phenomenon represents adaptive psychological mechanism unprecedented in modern warfare. Pilots have weaponized humor as defense against combat trauma. Rather than suppressing fear through discipline, German approach, or medicating it, American tendency, RAF crews acknowledge fear publicly through absurdist symbolism while simultaneously refusing to let fear dictate behavior. The duck becomes totem, representing collective survival. We're still here, still fighting, still painting ducks, still winning. But sustainability remained question. Every duck required maintenance. Every repainting consumed resources. Every hour spent on artwork represented hour not spent on critical repairs. As Britain entered autumn 1941, facing another winter of bombing, uncertainty hung over whether whimsical psychological gesture could survive grinding operational demands. The answer came through organic evolution. Ground crews simplified duck designs further, reducing painting time to 8 to 10 minutes. Squadrons began using aircraft recognition paint, material already allocated for identification markings, ensuring duck maintenance didn't compete with critical supplies. Pilots began helping with repainting during stand-down periods, fostering connection between aircrew and ground crews that improved overall unit cohesion. The rubber duck had survived transition from spontaneous gesture to institutional practice. What began as defiant joke was becoming permanent feature of RAF culture, embedded deeply enough to outlast individual squadrons, individual pilots, individual battles. The ducks were here to stay. 15th of September 1941, 11:42 hours. Luftwaffe, Intelligence Center, Abbeville, France. Hauptmann Werner Schulz, 33, stared at the reconnaissance photographs spread across his desk with growing frustration that bordered on genuine anger. Outside the converted chateau serving as regional Luftwaffe intelligence headquarters, autumn rain hammered against windows. Temperature, 11 degrees. Weather, miserable. Visibility, poor. Perfect conditions for RAF fighters to operate with reduced German observation, as evidenced by the increasing number of Spitfires appearing over France, despite Luftwaffe's supposed air superiority. But Schultz's frustration stemmed not from tactical situation, but from the photographs themselves. 16 separate images, taken by different reconnaissance aircraft over 3 weeks, all showing the same infuriating yellow markings on RAF fighters. Ducks, cheerful, cartoonish, inexplicable ducks, painted prominently on aircraft that should be operating under strictest combat discipline, that should reflect military professionalism expected of warriors engaged in existential struggle. "Anton," muttered Oberleutnant Friedrich Müller, Schultz's analyst, hovering over the photographs with magnifying glass. "They're definitely ducks. Waterfowl, simplified design, probably stenciled for consistency. Yellow pigment, likely cadmium-based, applied to fuselage below cockpit where maximum visibility ensured." "Yes, Friedrich, I can see they're ducks," Schultz snapped. "What I cannot determine is why. We've documented 23 separate RAF squadrons using these markings. That's systematic implementation, not individual eccentricity. There must be operational purpose, aircraft identification system, tactical designation, equipment variant indicator." The German intelligence apparatus had been struggling with rubber duck question for 4 months. Initial reports in May dismissed markings as isolated whimsy. By June, increasing prevalence demanded analysis. July brought dedicated investigation. August, formal intelligence briefing to Luftflotte 2 Command. September, still no satisfactory explanation. The problem exemplified fundamental disconnect between German and British military psychology. German forces operated under assumption that warfare was rational enterprise requiring systematic organization. Doctrine, discipline, efficiency, these were German military virtues. Individualism, improvisation, humor were viewed as signs of poor discipline that competent command would suppress. RAF's rubber ducks violated these assumptions. German analysts couldn't conceive that markings served no tactical purpose, that they were simply psychological gesture. Every intelligence assessment began with premise: the British are implementing systematic program. We must determine its purpose. None considered alternative. The British are taking the piss because that's how they cope with catastrophic casualties. Schultz's investigation had consumed considerable resources. He'd interviewed captured RAF pilots, none of whom provided useful intelligence. "It's just a duck, mate," said Flight Sergeant Peter Collins after his Spitfire was shot down over Calais. "Keep spirits up. Reminds us we're human." The answer seemed deliberately evasive. Surely there was deeper meaning. Luftwaffe fighter pilots reported even more confusing observations. Lieutenant Hans Dietrich, experienced Bf 109 pilot with 31 confirmed kills, described encounter from 8th August. "I engaged duck-marked Spitfire at 15,000 feet. Expected standard RAF tactics, defensive turn, attempt to climb away. Instead, British pilot executed aggressive head-on pass whilst waggling wings in what appeared to be mocking gesture. Then broke hard left, reversed, got behind me, nearly shot me down whilst I was still processing what happened. It was as if the duck marking gave pilot permission to violate doctrine, to improvise instinctively. This was the pattern. Duck-marked RAF fighters consistently demonstrated more aggressive, unpredictable tactics. German pilots who engaged them reported higher stress levels, increased ammunition expenditure, greater difficulty achieving kill positions. After-action reports included phrases like, "Opponent displayed unusual confidence," and "British pilot appeared to enjoy combat rather than fear it." The psychological impact manifested measurably. Luftwaffe squadrons operating over Britain in summer 1941 showed increasing combat stress indicators. Pilots reported nightmares about duck-marked Spitfires. Some developed superstitious avoidance, refusing to engage duck-marked aircraft when alternatives existed. Squadron medical officers noted rising anxiety levels, increased complaints of exhaustion, requests for transfer away from RAF combat operations. Oberst Heinrich Böhmer, Jagdgeschwader 26 Commander, addressed issue during September briefing. "Gentlemen, we are professional military aviators being psychologically destabilized by cartoon waterfowl. This is unacceptable. The British markings are deliberate provocation designed to undermine confidence. They want us believing those squadrons are special, elite, dangerous. In reality, they're identical aircraft flown by exhausted pilots with inadequate training. The ducks mean nothing." But Böhmer's reassurance failed because it contradicted lived experience. Duck-marked squadrons were demonstrably more dangerous. Statistical analysis of combat encounters showed duck squadrons achieved 22% higher kill ratios than unmarked RAF units. Duck pilots survived longer. Average operational lifetime 47 days versus 33 days for standard RAF pilots. They demonstrated better situational awareness, superior formation discipline, more aggressive tactics. German intelligence developed multiple theories, attempting to explain correlation. Theory 1. Ducks indicated experimental equipment. Analysis. No evidence of weapons or engine modifications. Theory 2. Ducks marked elite volunteer units. Analysis. Captured pilots showed normal skill distribution. Many were replacement pilots with minimal experience. Theory 3. Ducks identified aircraft using new radio systems. Analysis. Radio intercepts showed standard RAF communications equipment. Every theory collapsed under scrutiny. The ducks appeared to work through mechanism German analysts couldn't comprehend. Pure psychological empowerment. British pilots believed ducks made them better, so they flew with greater confidence, took calculated risks, supported wingmen more effectively. The belief created reality through changed behavior. More insidiously, ducks weaponized British cultural identity against German expectations. Luftwaffe pilots expected enemies to behave rationally under fear of death. Most humans do. But British culture possessed peculiar tradition of responding to catastrophe with humor, of deliberately appearing unconcerned whilst privately terrified, of maintaining composure through studied nonchalance. This cultural trait, amplified by duck symbolism, created psychological asymmetry in combat. German pilot shoots at duck-marked Spitfire, expects fear response. Instead, British pilot laughs internally at absurdity of situation. "I'm about to die, and I'm flying a fighter painted with a rubber duck." That microsecond of dark humor provides emotional distance from terror, allows rational tactical thinking to continue, whilst limbic system screams panic. British pilot executes successful evasion, counterattacks, scores kill, whilst German pilot still processes why opponent didn't behave as expected, the effect amplified in sustained engagements. First encounter with duck squadron, German pilots puzzled. Second encounter, concerned. Third, actively anxious. Fourth, superstitious fear. The duck squadrons are different became accepted wisdom among Jagdwaffe pilots, despite high command insistence that no difference existed. Captured Luftwaffe documents from October 1941 revealed extent of psychological impact. One intelligence summary stated, "British fighter markings utilizing waterfowl imagery continue proliferating without identified tactical purpose. Effect on pilot morale observed, but mechanism unexplained. Recommend treating duck-marked aircraft as priority threats during engagement, allocating experienced pilots to counter them. New pilots should avoid duck squadrons until combat experience developed." This represented extraordinary intelligence failure. Germany's sophisticated military analysis apparatus, capable of decoding encrypted communications and predicting Allied strategic intentions, completely missed fundamental truth. The ducks were joke that worked. No special equipment, no elite selection, no tactical innovation, just cartoon birds that gave exhausted pilots permission to laugh at death while simultaneously refusing to surrender to it. By late autumn 1941, German frustration with duck phenomenon reached command level. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief, allegedly demanded explanation during staff meeting. "Why are my pilots being psychologically defeated by British cartoon animals? This is humiliation. Determine what these markings mean and develop countermeasure immediately." But no countermeasure existed. Germany couldn't replicate the effect because German military culture didn't permit same psychological freedom. Luftwaffe squadrons operated under strict discipline, emphasizing obedience, hierarchy, systematic execution. Painting cartoon animals on Wehrmacht aircraft would be seen as undermining military professionalism. The German response to catastrophic stress was increased discipline, not irreverent humor. The British had accidentally discovered psychological weapon perfectly calibrated to exploit German cultural assumptions. The ducks represented everything German military philosophy considered weakness, individualism, whimsy, apparent lack of seriousness. Yet in practice, these weaknesses provided psychological resilience superior to German discipline-based approach. The final irony emerged in November when captured RAF pilot explained duck phenomenon to Schultz during interrogation. "It's not complicated, mate. War's terrifying. People die. We're exhausted, scared, losing friends every week. Duck reminds us we're British. We laugh at terrible things because it's better than crying. Helps us keep fighting when rational people would quit." Schultz wrote in his intelligence report, "Conclusion: RAF duck markings serve no tactical military purpose. Function is purely psychological morale maintenance. Effect: significant enhancement of combat effectiveness through cultural mechanisms German forces cannot replicate. Recommendation: accept duck-marked squadrons as persistent tactical disadvantage. Allocate additional resources to counter increased effectiveness." The recommendation was filed, discussed, ultimately ignored. By December 1941, larger strategic concerns dominated German attention. But the ducks remained, cheerful yellow symbols flying across European battlefields, driving German pilots to distraction, whilst British pilots smiled behind their oxygen masks. 8th May 1945, 16:34 hours. Woodray Hornchurch, Essex. The champagne was warm and the glasses were chipped, but nobody cared. Outside the officers' mess, spring sunshine illuminated rows of Spitfires, many still bearing faded yellow duck markings that had become synonymous with Fighter Command's identity. Temperature 18 degrees, weather clear, sirens silent. For the first time in 2,077 days, Britain was no longer at war. Germany had surrendered. The guns had stopped. Wing Commander James Mallard, now 34, stood beside the same aircraft he'd first decorated with a rubber duck on that desperate morning in May 1941. The duck was barely visible now. 4 years of combat operations, countless repaintings, weather exposure had reduced it to ghostly outline. But its symbolic power remained undimmed. This single Spitfire had survived 437 combat sorties, flown by 11 different pilots. 6 of those pilots died. 5 survived, including Mallard. The duck had become their shared talisman, their collective memory, their proof that humor could coexist with horror. The statistical accounting of the rubber duck phenomenon revealed extraordinary impact. Between May 1941 and May 1945, approximately 1,147 RAF fighters bore duck markings at various times across 47 squadrons. These squadrons collectively flew 89,234 combat sorties, engaged Luftwaffe aircraft 14,782 times, achieved 3,121 confirmed aerial victories, while suffering 1,102 aircraft losses in combat. The kill-to-loss ratio of 3.56.1 significantly exceeded RAF average of 2.89/1 for non-duck squadrons operating same aircraft types in same tactical environments. More remarkably, duck squadrons demonstrated 31% lower psychological casualty rates throughout war. Pilots experiencing combat stress breakdown, classified as lack of moral fiber cases, occurred at 4.7 per 100 pilots in Duck squadrons versus 6.8 per 100 in standard squadrons. Operational effectiveness metrics showed Duck squadrons maintained combat readiness 12% longer during sustained campaigns. Unit cohesion, measured through pilot retention and formation discipline, rated consistently higher in after-action assessments. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, Fighter Command's former commander during Battle of Britain, reflected on phenomenon in his 1946 memoir. The rubber duck represented quintessentially British response to existential crisis. When faced with possibility of national annihilation, our pilots painted cartoon animals on their weapons of war. Absurd? Certainly. Effective? Undeniably. The ducks gave permission to acknowledge fear whilst refusing to surrender to it, to laugh at death while simultaneously fighting tooth and nail against it. This psychological duality, serious warriors who refused to take themselves too seriously, proved impossible for German mindset to counter. But the ducks' legacy extended far beyond military statistics. During war, they'd become cultural phenomenon visible to British civilians. Newsreel footage of RAF operations inevitably included close-ups of duck-marked fighters. Propaganda posters featured them. Children drew pictures of the Duck Squadron defending Britain. The imagery penetrated national consciousness as symbol of British defiance and resilience. The impact on Luftwaffe psychology remained measurable through captured documents and post-war interviews. Former Oberleutnant Hans Schmidt, interviewed in 1947, provided candid assessment. The ducks haunted us. Not because they were frightening, they were ridiculous. But that ridiculousness represented something we couldn't comprehend or counter. British pilots were dying at appalling rates, yet still maintained humor. They were losing but wouldn't accept defeat psychologically. Our doctrine said, destroyed nation surrenders. Britain kept painting ducks. It was frustrating, demoralizing, eventually terrifying because it proved our fundamental assumptions about warfare were wrong. The psychological warfare implications weren't lost on post-war military analysts. The ducks demonstrated that morale weapons could be as effective as material weapons, that cultural identity properly leveraged could provide tactical advantage, that enemies' psychological assumptions could be exploited through symbolic gestures requiring minimal resources. A tin of yellow paint and a stencil had arguably saved hundreds of British lives by improving pilot effectiveness and reducing combat stress casualties. But perhaps most significantly, the ducks proved that military effectiveness didn't require suppressing humanity. German military culture emphasized discipline through dehumanization, soldiers as interchangeable components in systematic machine. British approach, exemplified by ducks, allowed individuals to remain fully human whilst executing lethal combat operations. Pilots could acknowledge fear, celebrate friendships, mourn losses, laugh at absurdity, and simultaneously be more effective warriors precisely because they maintained emotional connection to life they were defending. The immediate post-war period saw duck markings gradually disappear. RAF transitioned to peacetime structure. Aircraft were retired or repainted to standard schemes. Squadrons disbanded or reformed. By 1948, virtually no operational aircraft bore duck markings. The phenomenon appeared to be ending as wartime memory faded. Except it didn't end. The ducks had embedded themselves too deeply in RAF cultural DNA. Veterans shared stories. Squadron historians documented the tradition. New pilots learned about the duck squadrons during training. When tensions escalated during Cold War, duck markings began reappearing. Unofficial at first, then tolerated by command, eventually formally recognized as legitimate unit insignia. The 1982 Falklands War saw RAF Harriers deploying with duck markings painted by ground crews as tribute to wartime tradition. Gulf War 1991. Tornado fighters bore miniature ducks on mission counts. Afghanistan and Iraq conflicts. Multiple RAF squadrons adopted duck variations. Each generation of pilots rediscovered that the absurd symbol helped them cope with terrible work of combat flying. Squadron leader Patricia Morrison, the ferry pilot who'd witnessed duck implementation at Biggin Hill, lived to age 92, dying in 2006. Before her death, she reflected, "People ask what the ducks meant. They meant we were human. They meant we refused to let war destroy the parts of us that made life worth defending. They meant we chose to laugh when we could have chosen to despair." 60 years later, I still believe that choice, laughing instead of despairing, was what actually won the war. Germany had better technology, more resources, superior tactics, but they couldn't counter our refusal to psychologically surrender. The duck represented that refusal. The academic study of rubber duck phenomenon emerged in 1970s as military historians gained access to classified documents. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell's 1978 dissertation, Psychological Warfare Through Symbolic Absurdism, RAF Duck Markings, 1941-1945, analyzed captured German intelligence reports showing extent of Luftwaffe confusion and resources diverted attempting to decode non-existent tactical meaning. Her conclusion: the British accidentally created perfect psychological operation by doing something purely for domestic morale that coincidentally weaponized cultural differences against opponent. Modern RAF officially recognizes duck markings as legitimate historical tradition. RAF Museum Hendon displays restored Spitfire bearing original 1941 duck marking. Squadron 603, Mallard's original unit, still uses stylized duck as official insignia. New pilots undergo informal ceremony receiving rubber duck figure upon completing operational training. Reminder of tradition, of resilience, of refusing to take yourself too seriously even when engaged in deadly serious work. The broader cultural impact extended beyond military. "Keep calm and carry on" became famous post-war British motto, but "paint a duck and keep flying" arguably better captured actual wartime British psychology. The ducks represented approach to crisis that became core component of British national identity, acknowledged terrible reality, maintain dark humor, refuse to surrender psychologically, continue functioning effectively despite catastrophic circumstances. In 2015, historian Lord Andrew Roberts wrote, "The rubber ducks of 1941 demonstrate war's fundamental paradox. The side that maintains humanity whilst executing inhumane violence often possesses decisive psychological advantage. Germany turned soldiers into weapons. Britain allowed warriors to remain human beings who happened to be fighting war." The ducks symbolized that difference, and that difference amplified across thousands of individual decisions in moments of crisis, ultimately determined which system proved more resilient under sustained stress. The final testament came from Berlin, unexpectedly. In 2019, German Military Museum mounted exhibition examining Luftwaffe's psychological challenges during Battle of Britain. Featured prominently, captured reconnaissance photographs of duck-marked RAF fighters alongside German intelligence reports attempting to decode their meaning. Exhibition curator noted, "These documents show how psychological assumption can become strategic vulnerability. We presumed British would respond to warfare rationally, with fear, with eventual surrender. The ducks proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. They weren't tactical marking. They were declaration: we refuse to let you define how we respond to this crisis." And that refusal, that insistence on maintaining identity and humor whilst simultaneously fighting with utter determination, was weapon we had no defense against. As veterans gathered at Hornchurch in 2020 for 75th anniversary of VE Day, few original duck pilots remained alive. Thomas Whitfield, 110 years old, Britain's oldest surviving Spitfire pilot, sat before the restored aircraft he'd flown in 1941. The duck marking had been meticulously recreated from wartime photographs. Someone asked what he remembered most about the war. Whitfield smiled, touched the yellow duck gently. "This," he said simply, This ridiculous, perfect, utterly British response to being told we were finished. We painted a cartoon on a weapon of war and went out to prove that humor and humanity could defeat ideology and machinery, and we were right. God help me, we were right. The sun set over Hornchurch. The duck-marked Spitfire sat silent, preserved museum piece rather than weapon, but its message endured. That resilience takes many forms, that laughter can coexist with tears, that nations define themselves not through how they respond to victory, but how they refuse to surrender during apparent defeat. The rubber duck, absurd and perfect, remained proof that sometimes the most powerful weapons are the ones that remind warriors why life is worth defending. Britain survived 1941 not just because of radar, Spitfires, or Churchill's speeches. It survived because ordinary people refused to let extraordinary crisis destroy their fundamental identity. The ducks flew because British souls refused to be conquered. That lesson, painted in cheerful yellow on grey metal, would endure as long as free people faced tyranny and chose to laugh while simultaneously fighting. The legacy was complete. The ducks had earned their place in history. If this story of British resilience, ingenuity, and defiant humor resonated with you, I'd be immensely grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. We uncover the forgotten extraordinary tales from the Second World War, the human stories behind the grand strategy, the moments of unexpected brilliance that changed history's course. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join our community of history enthusiasts who believe the past still has vital lessons for the present. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What other unexpected psychological tactics from WW2 should we explore? Which aspect of British wartime ingenuity most surprises you? Share your thoughts, your family stories, your own connections to this extraordinary period. History isn't just dates and battles. It's the collective memory we build together. Thank you for watching. Remember, keep calm, paint a duck, and carry on.